In the pre-dawn darkness of December 8, 1941, while the fires from Pearl Harbor still burned and America reeled from the worst military disaster in its history, a Navy radio operator named Evelyn Grace Thornton sat at her station in the communications center at Cavite Naval Base in the Philippines and began transmitting the desperate messages that would chronicle the beginning of America's darkest hour in the Pacific, and she did not know, as her fingers flew across the telegraph key, that within weeks she would send the final message, before the base fell, and the silence that followed would last for 3.5 years. Evelyn had grown up in the small farming community of Cedar Falls, Iowa, the daughter of a telephone lineman and a school teacher who had instilled in her a love of learning and a determination to see the world beyond the cornfields of her childhood, and in 1936, at the age of 20, she had done something almost unheard of for a young woman from rural Iowa, which was to enlist in the United States Navy. And when the recruiters told her that women could only serve as nurses or clerical staff, she said that was fine because what she really wanted was to learn radio operations, and they laughed, but they let her try, and within a year she was one of the best operators in the fleet. She was assigned to the Philippines in early 1941 as part of the Navy's expansion of communications infrastructure in the Pacific, and she arrived in Manila in March, feeling like she had stepped into another world, because the Philippines were beautiful and exotic and seemed impossibly far from the cornfields of Iowa, and she fell in love with the islands and the people, and she wrote letters home describing the sunsets over Manila Bay, and the music in the streets, and the feeling that anything was possible in this place where East met West, and she had no idea that within 9 months the paradise would become a hell. But what happened next changed everything, because on December 8, 1941, which was December 7 on the other side of the international date line, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and within hours they attacked the Philippines as well, and Evelyn was at her station when the first bombs fell on Cavite, and she watched through the window as Japanese aircraft roared overhead and the base erupted in flames, and she kept transmitting because that was her job and the fleet needed to know what was happening. And she sent message after message describing the attack and the damage and the casualties. Well, the building shook around her. The Japanese air raids continued 4 days, destroying the American Air Force on the ground, and sinking ships in the harbor and reducing Cavite Naval Base to smoking rubble. And through it all, Evelyn stayed at her post, transmitting the increasingly desperate communications between the Philippines and Pearl Harbor, and she watched as the world she had known collapsed around her, and she learned in those terrible days what war really meant, because it was not glory or adventure, but burning bodies and screaming wounded, and the smell of death that never left your nostrils. And then something no one expected happened, because the Japanese did not just bomb the Philippines, they invaded with overwhelming force, landing troops throughout the islands and pushing the American and Filipino defenders back toward the Bataan Peninsula, and Evelyn was evacuated from Cavite just hours before it fell, and she was reassigned to Corregidor, the island fortress at the mouth of Manila Bay, where General Douglas MacArthur had established his headquarters and where the last American forces in the Philippines would make their stand. Corregidor was a nightmare of tunnels and bunkers carved into solid rock, and Evelyn worked in the Malinta Tunnel, a vast underground complex that housed the headquarters and hospital and communications center, and she transmitted messages in the flickering light of generators that struggled to keep running as Japanese artillery pounded the island day and night, and she breathed air thick with dust and diesel fumes, and she watched the wounded fill the hospital tunnels until there was no more room, and the doctors operated in the corridors. What she discovered next would shake her faith in everything she had believed, because as the weeks turned to months and the promised reinforcements never came, Evelyn realized that the Philippines had been abandoned, that there were no ships coming to save them, and no aircraft to drive back the Japanese, and that the messages she was transmitting were not pleas for immediate help, but rather documentation of a defeat that everyone in Washington had already accepted, and she kept transmitting anyway because the men fighting and dying on Bataan and Corregidor deserved to have their sacrifice witnessed. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because Evelyn was one of only a handful of women on Corregidor, and she became a symbol of hope for the soldiers and Marines who saw her moving through the tunnels, always calm, always professional, always at her post, and they called her the Voice of Corregidor, because hers were the fingers that tapped out the messages that let the world know they were still fighting, and she became in those dark months something more than a radio operator. She became a witness to heroism that the world might otherwise have forgotten. The fall of Bataan came on April 9, 1942, when 76 American and Filipino soldiers surrendered in the largest American military surrender in history, and Evelyn transmitted the messages reporting the disaster, and she wept as she tapped out the words because she knew many of the men who had just been captured, and she knew what the Japanese did to prisoners, and she felt a guilt that would never entirely leave her because she was safe in the tunnels of Corregidor while they marched into captivity and death. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because after Bataan fell, the Japanese turned their full attention to Corregidor, and the bombardment intensified until it seemed like the entire island was shaking and the air in the tunnels became almost unbreathable, and Evelyn worked shifts of 16 and 18 and 20 hours because operators were falling sick and wounded and dying, and someone had to keep the radios running, and she pushed herself beyond exhaustion because stopping was not an option. The final assault came on May 5, 1942, when Japanese forces landed on Corregidor under cover of darkness and fought their way through the beach defenses. And by morning it was clear that the fortress would fall, and General Jonathan Wainwright, the commander who had taken over when MacArthur was ordered to Australia, made the agonizing decision to surrender to prevent the massacre of the wounded in the hospital tunnels. And Evelyn was ordered to send one final message to Washington. The message she transmitted at 10:30 hours on May 6, 1942. "Read going off the air now. Goodbye and God bless." And then she destroyed her equipment, smashing the radios and burning the code books so they would not fall into Japanese hands, and she stood in the sudden silence of the communications center that had been filled with the chatter of Morse code for 5 months, and she listened to the sounds of the Japanese soldiers approaching, and she prepared herself for whatever came next. The silence that followed that final message lasted for 3.5 years, because Evelyn, along with the other American military personnel on Corregidor, was taken prisoner by the Japanese and transported to a series of prison camps where she endured conditions that defy description, because the Japanese did not recognize the Geneva Convention, and they treated prisoners with a cruelty that still haunts the memories of those who survived. And Evelyn was subjected to starvation and disease and forced labor, and she watched friends die around her, and she held on to life with a determination that amazed even herself. She survived by finding purpose in helping others, because even in the camps there was work for someone who understood communication and organization, and she helped run the secret information network that passed news between camps, and she taught other prisoners to tap out Morse code through the walls, and she kept track of the sick and the dying so that someday their families might know what had happened to them, and she refused to let the Japanese break her spirit, even when they broke her body. The liberation came on February 3, 1945, when American forces reached the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, and Evelyn was among the survivors who emerged, blinking into the sunlight, weighing less than 90 pounds and suffering from malaria and beriberi and wounds that would never fully heal, and she was evacuated to Hawaii and then to California, and she stood on American soil for the first time in 4 years, and she wept because she had never believed she would live to see home again. The Navy awarded her the Bronze Star for her service on Corregidor, and the Purple Heart for wounds suffered in captivity, and she was promoted to lieutenant, which was remarkable for a woman in 1945. And she received letters from the families of soldiers and Marines who remembered her as the voice of Corregidor, and who said that seeing her at her post had given them hope when hope seemed foolish, and she kept those letters for the rest of her life. She returned to Iowa after the war, and she married a farmer named Robert Hansen, who had served in Europe and who understood without being told that some things cannot be spoken about, and they raised 4 children on a farm not far from where Evelyn had grown up, and she never talked about the war except once a year on May 6th, when she would go alone to the small memorial she had built in the back garden and sit in silence for an hour, remembering the last message and the long silence that followed. Evelyn Grace Thornton Hansen died in 2001 at the age of 80, and her obituary was carried by newspapers across the country, because by then her story had become known through documentaries and books about the fall of the Philippines, and people came from all over to attend her funeral, including survivors of Corregidor and their children and grandchildren, and the commander of the Naval Communications School, who said that Evelyn represented everything that was best about the Navy and about America. Her final message, going off the air now. Goodbye. God bless, is now displayed at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Texas, alongside the telegraph key she used to send it, and visitors stand before that simple message and try to imagine what it must have been like to tap out those words, knowing that the silence that followed might last forever, and knowing that everything you had fought for was being lost, and some of them cry because some messages carry a weight that transcends time. She was asked once in an interview decades after the war what she wanted people to remember about Corregidora. And she said she wanted them to remember that the people there were ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things, not because they wanted to be heroes, but because there was work to be done, and someone had to do it. And she said the real heroes were the ones who never came home, and she hoped that as long as anyone remembered that last message, they would also remember the men and women who sent all the messages that came before it, because every single one of those messages was a voice crying out from the darkness saying, "We are still here and we are still fighting, and please God, do not forget us."